The parchment crinkled under my father's trembling fingers as he unrolled what he thought was his golden ticket to fortune. I watched from across the mahogany desk in his study, my face carefully blank, as his eyes widened with greed at the intricate lines I'd drawn, each one a calculated lie, each mark a breadcrumb leading straight to his ruin. This is it, Ilara, he breathed, his voice thick with the same excitement I'd heard in my previous life when he'd discovered my real talents. The same tone he'd used right before he stole everything from me. The lost mines of Valdris. You've actually found them. I smiled, the expression never reaching my eyes. Yes, Father, I found them. And this time I'm giving you exactly what you deserve. The memory of my death was still fresh, even though I'd been living this second life for 23 years now. In my first life, I died at 47, broken and alone in a charity hospital ward, my body riddled with cancer that could have been treated if I'd had money, if my family hadn't stolen everything from me. The moment before I'd closed my eyes for what I thought was the last time, I'd wished, begged for one more chance. Not to relive my life exactly, but to have the knowledge, the foresight, to protect myself from the vipers I'd called family. When I'd woken up as a newborn, the memories of my past life locked in an infant's mind, I'd thought I was going insane. But as I grew, as I relearned to walk and talk, I realized the universe had granted me an impossible gift, rebirth with foreknowledge. I knew every betrayal that was coming. I knew every trick my family would pull. And most importantly, I knew the single talent that would make them all destroy themselves in their greed. In my first life, I discovered at age 15 that I had an almost supernatural gift for cartography. I could look at terrain, any terrain, and instinctively understand it. Elevations, water tables, geological formations, hidden caves, and passages that others would miss. It wasn't magic exactly, but it was close. I could find things, lost things, valuable things. And when I'd proudly shown my father my first real map at 16, a map that had led to a small cache of historical artifacts worth a modest fortune, everything had changed. He hadn't celebrated my gift. He'd exploited it. For the next 20 years in my first life, my father had forced me to create map after map, discovery after discovery, while he and my stepmother Marina and my half-sister Celestia took all the credit and all the profit. They'd paraded me around like a trained dog, forcing me to find treasures and archaeological sites, then locked me away when investors and buyers came calling. Celestia would stand in front of museum curators with my maps, claiming she'd drawn them, claiming she had the gift. My father would negotiate deals, selling my discoveries for millions, and I'd see none of it. When I'd finally tried to break free at 35, tried to tell the truth about who the real cartographer was, my father had ruined me. He'd had me declared mentally incompetent, had me institutionalized for 6 months. By the time I'd gotten out, he'd legally seized all my work, all my maps, claiming them as family property since I'd created them while living under his roof. The courts had sided with him. I'd been left with nothing. The remaining 12 years of my first life had been a slow descent into poverty and sickness. I'd tried to rebuild, but my father had poisoned my reputation in academic circles, in archaeological societies, everywhere that might have hired me. I'd ended up working menial jobs, unable to afford treatment when the cancer came, dying alone and forgotten while my family enjoyed the wealth built on my stolen talent. But this time I was ready. From the moment I could control my infant hands, I'd started planning. I'd let my family think I was normal, unremarkable, perhaps even a bit slow. I'd hidden my gift completely. When I was 12 and my father had started taking me on his educational trips to survey lands, the same trips where he'd discovered my talent in my first life, I'd deliberately failed every test, every challenge. I'd drawn maps that were slightly wrong, just enough to be useless, but not enough to seem like I was trying to sabotage. She's a disappointment, I'd heard him tell Marina when he thought I couldn't hear. No talent at all, nothing like her mother. My mother. My real mother, who died when I was 8 in both lifetimes. I'd loved her fiercely, but even she hadn't been able to protect me from my father's ambition. After her death, he'd married Marina within 6 months, a cold woman who'd brought her equally cold daughter, Celestia, into our home. In my first life, I'd tried to be kind to them, tried to be a good sister to Celestia. They'd repaid that kindness with betrayal at every turn. This time, I kept my distance. I was polite, but remote. I focused on my studies, particularly art and history, subjects that seemed impractical to my father. At least learn something useful, he'd sneer. Your sister is studying business and archaeology. She'll actually contribute to this family. Celestia, beautiful, charming Celestia, who in my first life had pretended to be my friend while stealing my work, who'd smiled at me while testifying against me in court, claiming I'd always been disturbed and delusional. In this life, I watched her carefully, noting how she'd sidle up to me whenever I sketched anything, trying to see if I had any hidden talent she could claim. I gave her nothing. Instead, I went to university and studied art history with a focus on historical cartography and forgery detection. Ironic, perhaps, but I learned everything about how to spot fake maps, and more importantly, how to create ones that would pass expert scrutiny. I learned the aging techniques, the proper inks and papers from different eras, the styles of legendary cartographers throughout history. I became an expert in my field, publishing several well-regarded papers under a pseudonym about historical map authentication. And all the while, I built my trap. I knew from my previous life that my father had always been obsessed with the legend of the lost mines of Valdres, a supposedly mythical treasure trove of silver and gems that had been hidden during a civil war 3 centuries ago. He'd wasted a fortune in my first life searching for it, dragging me along to map every possible location. We'd never found it because, I'd eventually realized, it didn't exist. It was a fairy tale, a legend inflated over time, probably based on nothing more than a small silver cache that had been discovered and depleted centuries ago. But my father didn't know that. In this life, he still didn't know that. When I graduated with honors at 22, I'd returned home briefly before announcing my intention to move to the capital and work as a humble cartographer for the National Archives. It was a low-paying, unglamorous job, the kind of position that made my father sneer with satisfaction at my lack of ambition. "I should have known you'd amount to nothing," he'd said at dinner the night before I left. "Your sister is already making a name for herself in archaeological consulting, but you, drawing maps of sewer systems and property boundaries? Pathetic." I'd smiled and nodded, accepting his contempt, while inside I was counting down the days. For the next year, I'd worked my quiet job, lived in my small apartment, and used every spare moment to craft my masterpiece, a map that would destroy my family completely. I'd used parchment that I'd carefully aged using techniques I'd learned in university, treated with tannins and smoke, to give it the perfect yellowed patina of 300-year-old paper. I'd mixed my inks using historical recipes, creating the exact shades that would have been available in the era when the mines supposedly went missing. I'd studied the handwriting of known cartographers from that period, practiced until I could perfectly replicate the shaky, elaborate style. But the real genius was in the map itself. I'd drawn a path that led deep into the Thornback Mountains, a treacherous range that bordered our country. The terrain was real. I'd studied geological surveys and satellite imagery obsessively. The landmarks I'd marked were real. The paths were navigable, if difficult. Everything about the map screamed authenticity, except for the destination. The lost mines of Valdres on my map were located in a valley that did exist, in a cave system that was real. But I knew from geological surveys that the caves were unstable, prone to flooding, and absolutely worthless for mining. There was no silver, no gems, just dangerous, worthless rock. More importantly, the land was owned by the Verkov Corporation, a mining company with a reputation for absolutely savage litigation. They'd bankrupted dozens of prospectors and small companies who'd trespassed on their claims. They had lawyers who made sharks look gentle, and a security team that had been known to detain trespassers for weeks while sorting out legal issues. My map led straight onto their most protected claim, in an area they'd posted with every kind of no trespassing warning possible. And I'd made sure that anyone following the map would have to bypass multiple security checkpoints, cut through fences, and essentially commit a dozen crimes before they even reached the supposed mine entrance. It was beautiful. It was perfect. And I knew my father would fall for it completely. The hardest part had been the discovery. I couldn't just show up with the map. That would be suspicious. I needed to make him think he'd found it, that it was his idea to pursue it. So I'd planted breadcrumbs. First, I'd accidentally left research notes in my apartment during a rare family visit. Notes about historical silver mines, about the Valdres legend, about authentication techniques for old documents. Celestia had snooped, of course, just as I'd known she would. I'd seen her photographing my notes with her phone when she thought I was in the bathroom. Then I'd started frequenting a specific cafe near the National Archives, a place I knew was popular with antiquities dealers and collectors. I'd brought props, aged map fragments, reference books, authentication equipment. I'd made sure to be seen consulting these materials, looking excited, looking like I was on the verge of something big. I'd even staged a few phone calls with an earshot of people who I knew were gossips, people who'd spread rumors in the right circles. Yes, I need to verify the provenance. 17th century, possibly earlier, by silver mine markers, yes. No, I can't discuss it further until I'm certain. Within 2 months, the rumors had spread exactly as I'd planned. The family grapevine was buzzing with whispers that Alara, the disappointing daughter, might have stumbled onto something valuable. That she was being secretive about it. That she was acting strange. I'd waited, pretending to be oblivious, until my father finally showed up at my apartment 3 weeks ago, Marina and Celestia in tow. "We're worried about you," he'd said, his concern as fake as my map. "We've heard you've been acting oddly, obsessive. We thought we should check in." I'd played it perfectly. First defensive, then reluctant, then breaking down as if I couldn't handle the secret anymore. I'd told them about the map I'd found in the archive's unclassified collection, hidden in a bundle of worthless property surveys. I'd explained how I'd been secretly authenticating it, how I was sure it was real, but afraid to tell anyone because I didn't trust myself. "After all," I'd said, my voice perfectly calibrated to sound self-deprecating, "Father always said I had no talent for this. I was probably wrong about the map, too." I'd watched my father's eyes light up with that old familiar greed. "Let me see it," he'd demanded. "I may have been too harsh before. Perhaps you do have some small gift for evaluation." I'd shown him the map with perfect reluctance, let him examine it while I pretended to be nervous. I'd watched him practically vibrate with excitement as he recognized the legends he'd studied for decades, saw the landmarks he'd searched for in my first life. "This is extraordinary," he'd breathed. "Alara, do you understand what this could be?" "I thought it might be a fake," I'd said hesitantly. "That's why I didn't say anything. I didn't want to disappoint you again." No, this is real. I can feel it. The style, the materials. Where did you say you found this?" I'd explained, watching him grow more excited by the minute. Marina and Celestia had crowded around, their eyes equally hungry. I could see them already planning how to take this from me, just like last time. But this time, I was ready for that too. "I want to sell it," I'd announced suddenly. "I need money. The archives doesn't pay well, and I have debts. I know it's probably worth more than I think, but I just want enough to be comfortable." The three of them had exchanged glances. I could practically hear their thoughts. She's so naive, so stupid. She has no idea what she's found. "How much do you want?" my father had asked carefully. I'd named a figure, 50,000 marks, a substantial amount of money for me, but nothing compared to what a genuine map to a legendary treasure would be worth. Deliberately undervalued, an obvious sign that I didn't understand what I had. My father had tried to hide his satisfaction. "That seems reasonable. For family, though I should tell you, you might be giving this away for much less than it's worth." "I know," I'd said, playing the part perfectly. "But I trust you, Father, and I don't have the connections or knowledge to sell it properly. You have experience with these things. You could probably make a fortune with it." The hook was set. I could see it in his eyes. Not just the greed for treasure, but the satisfaction of once again stealing from his disappointing daughter. He probably thought he was being clever, paying me a pittance for something priceless. "I'll give you 75,000, he'd said, pretending to be generous. "Family should look out for each other." I'd accepted with grateful tears. The next 2 weeks had been a masterclass in watching my family's greed consume them. My father had immediately mortgaged our family estate to raise capital for an expedition. He'd liquidated investments, borrowed from friends, even convinced Marina to drain her personal accounts. He'd told everyone it was for a sure thing, a discovery that would make them all wealthy beyond imagination. Celestia had started shopping for luxury items she couldn't yet afford, running up credit card debt in anticipation of the fortune to come. Marina had already commissioned architects to design an addition to the estate, planned elaborate parties to celebrate their impending wealth. I'd watched it all unfold through the family group chat I was still reluctantly part of, through social media posts they were too excited to hide, through phone calls with distant relatives who couldn't believe the family's good fortune. And through it all, I'd maintained my role as the naive, grateful daughter who'd finally done something right. 3 days ago, my father had called me to his study, the same study where I now sat, watching him examine the map with trembling hands. "I want to thank you properly," he'd said, pulling out a check. 75,000 marks, exactly as promised. "You've given this family a great gift, Alara. Perhaps I was wrong about you." I'd taken the check, holding back my smile. 75,000 marks that I'd immediately deposit and secure, money that would be safely mine no matter what happened next. Compensation, partial compensation, for everything they'd stolen from me in my first life. "There's something else," my father had continued. "I want you to come with us. To the mountains. You found the map, you should be there when we discover the mines." This was the moment I'd been planning for. The moment where in my first life I would have been excited, grateful for the inclusion. This time I knew exactly what it meant. They wanted me there to verify the location, to use whatever small talent they thought I might have, and then to blame me if anything went wrong. "I don't know," I'd said hesitantly. "I have work and I'm not really experienced with expeditions." "Nonsense," Marina had interjected. "You're part of this family. Besides, if the map is wrong, you'll need to be there to explain yourself." There it was, the veiled threat, the implication that I'd be held responsible if their treasure hunt failed. "When do we leave?" I'd asked quietly. 2 days, my father had said. "We've hired guides, obtained equipment. We're going to do this properly. The Thornback Mountains are no joke, but the reward will be worth it." I'd nodded, pretending to be nervous but excited. Inside, I was counting down the hours until everything came crashing down on them. Now, watching my father's hands shake with greed as he examined the map one final time before we departed, I felt a cold satisfaction settle in my chest. Tomorrow, we'd leave for the mountains. Within a week, my family would be exactly where they deserved to be. The expedition party assembled at dawn. My father had spared no expense. Or rather, had spared no expense of the money he'd borrowed and mortgaged and stolen from others. There were 6 professional guides, each costing a small fortune. There were pack animals loaded with equipment. There were supplies enough for 3 weeks in the mountains. Celestia arrived in designer hiking gear that probably cost more than my monthly salary, her hair perfect despite the early hour. Marina wore enough jewelry that she jingled when she walked. She'd refused to leave her precious gems behind, even for a mountain expedition. My father was dressed in expedition clothes that looked like they'd been pulled from an adventure movie, complete with a ridiculous wide-brimmed hat. I wore practical, broken-in hiking boots and weather-appropriate layers. I'd actually been on mountain surveys in my first life. I knew what was coming. "Everyone ready?" my father called out, playing the part of the great explorer. He'd invited 3 of his wealthy friends to join us, men who'd invested money in the expedition in exchange for a share of the profits. They stood nearby with their own expensive gear, looking excited and foolish. I noticed one of them filming with a professional camera. Of course, my father would want to document his great discovery. The footage would be perfect evidence later. "Let's make history," my father declared, and we set off. The first 2 days were exactly as I'd planned. The map led us along real trails, through authentic landmarks. Everything checked out. My father consulted with the guides, who confirmed that the route made sense, that we were following a legitimate path through the mountains. His confidence grew with every mile. Celestia complained constantly about the hiking, the cold, the lack of proper facilities. Marina kept checking her jewelry obsessively, terrified she'd lose something valuable. The investors laughed and joked about what they'd do with their share of the treasure. I stayed quiet, helpful when asked, careful to maintain my role as the naive daughter who'd gotten lucky. On the third day, we started seeing signs. The first was a fence, a serious fence, industrial grade, with barbed wire at the top and posted warnings every 20 feet. Private property, no trespassing. Violators will be prosecuted. Verkov Corporation. This must be it, one of the investors said excitedly. They're protecting the mines. Or it's just mining claims, I said hesitantly, playing my part. Maybe we should reconsider. Absolutely not, my father snapped. The map clearly shows the mines are beyond this point. This is probably just corporate land grabbing. They don't actually own the mines, they just think they do. One of the guides looked uncomfortable. Mr. Thorne, the Verkov Corporation is known for aggressive defense of their claims. Perhaps we should verify. I'm paying you to guide us, not to give me legal advice, my father interrupted. We're going forward. The guide exchanged glances with his colleagues, but didn't argue further. They'd been paid too much to walk away. We found a section where the fence had been partially damaged by fallen trees. Convenient, though actually the result of my having hiked this route 2 months ago and carefully sabotaging that specific section. My father ordered the WES, guides to create an opening large enough for us and the pack animals to squeeze through. My heart raced as we crossed onto Verkov land. In my previous life, I'd learned the hard way that Verkov didn't make idle threats. But this wasn't my previous life, and I wasn't the one who'd decided to trespass. The second sign came an hour later, security cameras, clearly visible, some even rotating to track our movement. Beneath them were signs in multiple languages warning that the area was under 24-hour surveillance. They're watching us, Marina said nervously. Let them watch, my father replied, though I could see sweat beading on his forehead. We'll be in and out with the treasure before they can respond. These mountains are huge. It'll take them days to send anyone. He was wrong. I knew Verkov had helicopter response teams, but I didn't correct him. By the fourth day, we'd penetrated deep into Verkov territory. The map led us exactly where I'd drawn it to go, toward a valley between two peaks where the geological surveys I'd studied indicated the presence of old caves. According to my map, the mines were hidden in one of these caves. We're close, my father kept saying, his excitement palpable. I can feel it. We're so close. Celestia had stopped complaining, caught up in the treasure fever. Marina was planning out loud how she'd spend her share. The investors were already discussing which museums they'd sell artifacts to, which auction houses handled historical treasures. None of them noticed the distant sound of helicopter rotors. I did, but I said nothing. We reached the valley on the fifth day. The cave system I'd marked on the map was real, exactly where I'd drawn it. My father practically ran toward the entrance, the guides hurrying to keep up. This is it, he shouted. The lost mines of Valdris. We've found them. The cave entrance was dramatic, a dark maw in the mountainside perfectly suited for treasure hunting fantasies. My father ordered the guides to set up lights to prepare equipment for entering. Everyone stays together, he commanded, and someone start filming. This is history in the making. We entered the caves with portable lights blazing, my father in the lead, consulting the map constantly. The caves wound deep into the mountain, exactly as I'd drawn them, based on geological surveys that marked them as worthless, but stable enough for exploration. There should be a chamber, my father muttered, studying the map. A large chamber about 300 feet in, with mine shafts leading off from it. We found the chamber. It was natural, created by ancient water flow, not by human hands. But in the dancing light of our torches, it looked like it could have been excavated. My father's excitement reached a fever pitch. The mine shafts, he said. According to the map, there are 3 of them. We need to check each one. The guides exchanged worried glances. Mr. Thorne, these caves aren't stable. We should test them more thoroughly before— I'm not waiting, my father shouted. But the treasure is here. I know it is. Alara, you found this map. Which shaft do we check first? This was my moment, the culmination of everything I'd planned. I don't know, Father, I said quietly. I'm not really good at this. Maybe we should listen to the guides. The middle one, Celestia suddenly announced, pointing. She'd been studying the map over my father's shoulder, trying to insert herself into the discovery just like she had in my first life. The map marks the middle shaft. That has to be it. My father nodded eagerly. The middle shaft, we'll start there. What none of them knew, what only I knew from my careful study of geological surveys, was that the middle shaft led to a section of cave that was structurally compromised, sitting right on top of an underground stream. The rock was porous, weakened by centuries of water damage. It wasn't immediately dangerous, we wouldn't die from cave-in. But the moment anyone started digging or disturbing the walls looking for silver veins. We ventured into the middle shaft, lights bobbing in the darkness. The tunnel was narrow, claustrophobic. Water dripped from the ceiling. There, my father shouted suddenly. Do you see that? The rock formation, that's not natural. That's been worked. He wasn't entirely wrong. There were marks in the rock, though they were likely from natural geological processes, not human tools. But in his excitement, he saw what he wanted to see. Start here, he ordered the guides. Carefully, check for loose stones, hidden entrances. One of the guides began tapping the wall with a geological hammer, testing the rock. Another started carefully excavating loose stones near what looked like a promising formation. That's when the water started. At first, it was just a trickle, a thin stream running down the wall where the guide had disturbed the rock. Then it became a flow. Then a gush. Stop, one of the guides shouted. We've breached the water table, everyone out, now. But my father was too caught up in his treasure fever. No, we're so close, just a few more. The wall collapsed. Not catastrophically, not dramatically. Just a sudden giving way of weakened rock, releasing a torrent of underground water that turned the narrow shaft into a river in seconds. We were knocked off our feet, swept back toward the main chamber by the force of the flood. I'd braced myself against the wall when I heard the first warning signs, so I wasn't caught in the worst of it, but my father, Celestia, Marina, and the investors were all swept away, tumbling in the dark, freezing water, their screams echoing off the cave walls. The guides managed to help everyone out of the main chamber and back toward the cave entrance, but we were all soaked, freezing, and shaken. Equipment was lost. One of the investors had a broken arm. My father was coughing up water, his fancy expedition. Hat long gone. And that's when the helicopters arrived, 3 of them landing in a clear space near the cave entrance, marked with the Verkov Corporation logo. Armed security personnel poured out along with men in suits carrying briefcases. Stay where you are, a voice boomed through a megaphone. You are trespassing on private property owned by the Verkov Corporation. By order of local law enforcement, you are all under detainment pending investigation. My father tried to protest, tried to explain, but the Verkov security team was efficient and practiced. They'd clearly done this before. Within minutes, we were all being loaded into the helicopters, our equipment seized as evidence. As we lifted off, I caught a glimpse of the valley below, the cave we'd just fled, the worthless rock that would never yield any treasure. I thought of the millions my father had borrowed, mortgaged, and spent on this expedition. I thought of the legal fees he was about to face. And I smiled. The next 3 weeks were a blur of holding cells, interviews, and lawyers. Verkov Corporation didn't just prosecute, they annihilated. They had evidence of every law we'd broken: trespassing, destruction of property, bypassing security systems, environmental violations from disturbing the cave system. They had camera footage of my father ordering the guides to cut through fences, of our entire expedition crossing clearly marked boundaries. They sued not just for restitution, but for punitive damages. They had a legal team that made my father's lawyers look like children playing dress-up. My father tried to explain about the map, about the lost mines of Valdris, about his right to search for historical treasures. The Verkov lawyers listened politely, then presented geological surveys proving that the area had been thoroughly investigated decades ago and contained nothing of value. They showed court documents proving Verkov's absolute ownership of the land and mineral rights. And then they turned to me. Ms. Thorne, the lead Verkov attorney said during one of the interviews, your father claims you found a historical map that led to these supposed mines. Is this true? I met his eyes calmly. I found a map, yes, in the National Archives, but I'm not a professional authenticator. I thought it might be real, but I was never certain. I told my father that multiple times. Do you have any proof of these warnings? I pulled out my phone and showed him the text messages I'd carefully sent to my father during the planning phase. Messages asking if he was certain about the map's authenticity. Messages suggesting we consult experts. Messages expressing doubt and concern. My father had ignored or dismissed every single one. And now there was a record. The attorney nodded slowly. And you received payment for this map? Yes, 75,000 marks. I thought I was selling family history, something that might have sentimental value. I had no idea my father was planning to mount an expedition, to trespass on private property. Another lie, smooth as silk. The 75,000 marks was safely in my account, money I'd already transferred to several secure investments. It was mine, paid to me legally, and I'd committed no crime in accepting it. My father had spent millions. I'd made 75,000. The math was delicious. As the legal proceedings dragged on, the full extent of my father's financial ruin became clear. He'd mortgaged the family estate to the point where the bank was already preparing foreclosure proceedings. He'd borrowed from friends who were now demanding repayment. The investors on the expedition were suing him for fraud, claiming he'd known the map was fake and had deliberately deceived them. Marina's jewelry, her precious, irreplaceable jewelry, had been confiscated as potential collateral for the massive fines and damages Verkov was demanding. She'd had a breakdown when they'd taken her rings, literally screaming and fighting the bailiffs until they'd sedated her. Celestia's credit card debt, run up in anticipation of treasure that would never come, was crushing her. Her reputation in the archaeological consulting world was destroyed. She was now known as the woman whose family had chased fairy tales into criminal trespassing. And my father. My father was facing potential prison time for the more serious charges. His legal bills alone were bankrupting him. Through it all, I played my role perfectly. The naive daughter who'd found something she thought was real, the reluctant family member who'd been pressured into selling a map she'd never been sure about, the victim of her family's greed and ambition. I showed the court my modest salary from the National Archives, my small apartment, my lack of expensive possessions. I was clearly not someone who'd benefited from any criminal enterprise. If anything, I was another victim of my father's obsession. The 75,000 marks? A legitimate sale of a historical document to a family member. I'd even paid taxes on it. 6 months after the expedition, the final judgments came down. My father was sentenced to 3 years in prison for criminal trespassing, destruction of property, and fraud. Verkov's civil suit was awarded in full. He owed them 8 million marks in damages and legal fees. The family estate was seized and sold. Everything was gone. Marina had a complete mental breakdown and was institutionalized. The loss of her lifestyle, her jewelry, her status, it was more than she could handle. Last I heard, she was in a long-term care facility, medicated and barely aware of the world around her. Celestia had declared bankruptcy. She was living in a one-room apartment, working as a retail clerk, all her dreams of archaeological consulting dead. Every time she tried to rebuild, the story of her family's treasure-hunting disaster resurfaced. She'd been reduced to nothing. The investors who'd accompanied us lost everything they'd put into the expedition. One of them was suing my father's estate, trying to recover something from the ruins. Another had moved abroad to escape his creditors. And me? I'd quietly continued my work at the National Archives. I'd published another well-received paper on historical map authentication. Ironic, given what I'd done, but no one made the connection. I'd used my 75,000 marks to invest wisely, building a comfortable nest egg. More importantly, I'd started consulting work on the side using a pseudonym. My gift for cartography, hidden for so long, was now available to select clients who could pay premium prices and keep secrets. Real maps this time. Honest work. I'd found 2 minor archaeological sites that led to legitimate discoveries, both of which I'd sold to museums under contracts that protected my anonymity but paid well. I wasn't rich, but I was comfortable, secure, free. 1 year after the expedition, I received a letter from my father. He was in prison, his world reduced to a cell, his future a blank wall of regret. "I don't understand," he wrote. "The map looked real. The authentication seemed legitimate. How could I have been so wrong?" I read the letter once, then burned it. He still didn't understand. He still thought his only mistake was believing a fake map, not the decades of abuse and theft that had brought him to this point. In his mind, he was the victim of bad luck, not the architect of his own destruction. But I understood, and that was enough. 2 years after the expedition, I finally allowed myself to visit my mother's grave. It was the first time I'd been back since my father's imprisonment. The cemetery was uncomfortably close to the ruins of our family estate, and I'd avoided the area. The headstone was simple, weathered by time. Beloved mother and wife, it read, though my father had barely visited after her death. Too busy planning his schemes. I kept my promise, I told her, kneeling in the grass. I protected myself this time. I made them pay for what they did, for what they would have done. They can't hurt anyone else now. The wind rustled through the trees, and I imagined I could feel her approval. In my first life, I died alone and broken, my gifts stolen, my life wasted, but the universe had given me an impossible second chance, and I'd used it not just to save myself, but to deliver justice. My father would spend years in prison, then emerge to a world where he had nothing, no money, no reputation, no family willing to support him. Marina would spend the rest of her life in institutional care, her mind shattered. Celestia would struggle in poverty, her dreams crushed, a living reminder that stolen glory never lasts, and I would continue my quiet life, my true talents hidden and protected, used on my own terms. The map had been fake, yes, but the destination had been real all along, a trap perfectly calibrated to catch the greedy, the cruel, the family who'd thought they could take from me without consequence. I stood, brushing grass from my knees, and walked away from my mother's grave with my head high. They'd wanted treasure. I'd given them exactly what they deserved. 3 years after the expedition, my life had settled into a comfortable rhythm that would have been unthinkable in my first life. My modest apartment in the capital had transformed into a real home. Not luxurious, but mine in every sense. The walls were lined with maps, some historical, some my own work, all legitimate. I'd published 2 books on historical cartography under my real name, both well-received in academic circles. The National Archives had promoted me to senior cartographer. The pay was better, though still modest, but my real income came from my private consulting work, where I'd built a reputation, under a pseudonym, as one of the best undiscovered talents in geographical analysis. I'd helped mining companies identify legitimate claims, assisted archaeologists in finding actual historical sites, and even consulted for several governments on border disputes. Every project was honest. Every map was real. I'd used my gift, my real gift, to build something that was truly mine. The irony wasn't lost on me. In my first life, my family had stolen my talent and used it for their own enrichment while keeping me prisoner. In this life, I'd used that same talent to destroy them, then built a legitimate career doing exactly what they'd forced me to do before. The difference was freedom, choice, control. I'd learned that my gift wasn't just about seeing terrain and understanding geology, though that was part of it. It was about understanding patterns, seeing connections that others missed, predicting how events would unfold based on careful observation. The same skills that let me map undiscovered territories let me map out my revenge with perfect precision. I'd thought about my family often in those 3 years, not with the burning rage I'd carried in my first life's final years, but with a cold satisfaction that never quite faded. My father had been released from prison after serving 2 years of his 3-year sentence, given early release for good behavior. I'd heard about it through the grapevine. I'd long since cut all contact, changed my phone number, made it clear I wanted nothing to do with the Thorne family name. He'd tried to rebuild, apparently, but at 65, with a criminal record, no money, and a reputation in ruins, there wasn't much rebuilding to be done. Last I heard, he was living in a single room in a boarding house, working as a night security guard. The man who'd once thrown elaborate dinner parties and bragged about his connections was now checking locks and watching empty buildings in the dark. Part of me wondered if he ever thought about what he'd done to deserve his fate. If he'd connected the dots, realized that his downfall hadn't been random bad luck, but cosmic justice delivered by the daughter he'd dismissed as worthless. I doubted it. Men like my father rarely achieved that kind of self-awareness. He probably still told himself stories about how the map had been cursed, how Verkov Corporation had been unreasonably harsh, how the universe had conspired against him. He'd never understand that the universe had simply given him exactly what he'd earned. Marina remained institutionalized, her condition unchanged. The loss of everything she'd valued had broken something fundamental in her psyche. The doctors said she experienced delusions, that she still believed she lived in the family estate, that her jewelry was merely misplaced and would be returned any day. I felt no pity for her. She'd watched my father abuse me in my first life and had done nothing. Worse, she'd encouraged it, seeing me as competition for family resources, as a threat to Celestia's position. She'd smiled while my life was stolen from me. Now she lived in a prison of her own mind, and that seemed fitting. Celestia was the one who haunted me most, not with guilt. I had no regrets about what I'd done to her. But I thought about her because, in some twisted way, we were mirror images. In my first life, she'd stolen my identity as a cartographer, claimed my gifts as her own, and built a career on my work. In this life, I'd revealed that she was nothing without someone else's talent to leech from. She'd struggled in poverty for 2 years before finally leaving the country, moving to some small coastal town where no one knew her story. I'd heard she was working in a tourist shop, selling cheap souvenirs to visitors, a far cry from the archaeological consultant she'd pretended to be. Sometimes I wondered if she understood the parallel, if she'd realized that her life in my first timeline had been just as fake as the map she'd encouraged our father to follow in this one. If she'd grasped that everything she'd had, everything she'd been, was built on stolen ground that would inevitably collapse. Probably not. Like our father, Celestia had always been too self-involved to see past her own desires, but the universe had a way of teaching lessons to those who refused to learn them willingly. On the 3-year anniversary of the expedition, I did something I'd never thought I'd do. I created a real map of the Thornback Mountains, marking the actual locations of potentially valuable mineral deposits I'd identified during my legitimate consulting work. I didn't sell it, I didn't publish it, I had it professionally framed and hung it in my apartment, directly across from my desk where I worked. It was a reminder, not of my revenge, I didn't need reminding of that, but of what I'd learned across 2 lifetimes, that truth and lies are both forms of maps, both ways of guiding people to destinations. The key is choosing which map to follow, which path to trust. My family had followed a false map to their destruction because they'd chosen greed over caution, theft over honesty, exploitation over respect. They'd mistaken my gift for something they could steal without consequence, my apparent weakness for actual vulnerability. They'd been wrong on every count. I'd drawn them a map that showed them exactly who they were, people who would happily break laws, destroy property, and risk everything for the promise of unearned wealth. People who would ignore every warning, dismiss every doubt if it meant they might get rich. The map had been fake, but the revelation had been absolutely real. Now I had my real maps, my honest work, my legitimate success. I had freedom and peace and the satisfaction of justice served. I had a life my family had never wanted me to have, built on a foundation they'd never thought I could create. And every time I looked at that framed map of the Thornback Mountains, the real one, showing real treasures they'd never find because they were too busy chasing fairy tales, I smiled. They'd wanted to steal my gift. Instead, I'd given them a gift they'd never forget. The gift of consequences. Sometimes the best revenge isn't about making your enemies suffer directly. It's about letting them destroy themselves with their own greed, their own choices, their own hands. It's about drawing them a map and watching them follow it straight into the trap they've built for themselves over years of cruelty. I'd have been a cartographer in both my lives, but in this one, I'd finally learned the most important lesson of map making. The destination matters less than the journey, and sometimes the most valuable treasure is the freedom to choose your own path. My family had chosen theirs. I'd simply provided accurate directions. And as I sat in my comfortable apartment, working on my latest legitimate commission, a geological survey for a museum interested in historical mining sites, I realized I'd achieved something I'd never managed in my first life. I was happy. Not the desperate, clinging happiness of someone trying to convince themselves that suffering would end. Not the bitter satisfaction of someone obsessed with revenge, but genuine contentment. The kind that comes from building something real with your own hands, from using your gifts on your own terms, from knowing that you've survived and thrived despite everything. The universe had given me a second chance, and I'd used it wisely, not just to punish those who'd wronged me, but to free myself from them entirely. My father had wanted to find treasure in those mountains. He'd searched for silver and gems, for physical wealth that would prove his worth and cement his status. But I'd found the real treasure long before we'd ever set foot in the Thornback Mountains. I'd found it in the moment I'd been reborn with my memories intact, when I'd realized I had the power to change everything. The treasure was knowledge. The treasure was time. The treasure was the ability to recognize danger before it destroyed you, and to plan your escape with perfect precision. The treasure was the chance to rewrite your story, and unlike the lost mines of Valdris, unlike my father's desperate fantasies of easy wealth, this treasure was real. I'd claimed it, I'd used it, I'd built a life with it, and no one could ever steal it from me again. As the sun set over the capital, painting my apartment in shades of gold and amber, I allowed myself a moment of gratitude for that impossible second chance, for the rebirth that had let me save myself, for the foreknowledge that had let me turn the tables on those who'd sought to use me. In my first life, I'd died asking for one more chance. In this life, I'd made that chance count. The map had been fake, yes, but the journey had been real, and the destination had been worth every carefully planned step. I was free, I was whole, I was mine, and that was the greatest treasure of all. 5 years after the expedition, I received an unexpected letter. It came to my office at the National Archives, forwarded from my old apartment. The handwriting on the envelope was shaky, unfamiliar. For a moment, I considered throwing it away unopened. I'd spent 5 years building walls between myself and my past, and I had no desire to let that past seep back in. But curiosity won. It always did. Inside was a single page written in that same trembling hand. Alara, I don't expect you to respond to this. I don't expect forgiveness. I just wanted you to know that I understand now. After 5 years of living with nothing, of working jobs I used to consider beneath me, of watching everything I built crumble, I understand. The map wasn't just fake. It was justice. You gave us exactly what we deserved. I took everything from you, and you let me take even more, right up until there was nothing left to take except my own destruction. I'm sorry. I know it means nothing now, but I'm sorry for every moment I failed you as a father, for every time I chose greed over love, ambition over family, my ego over your well-being. You were a gift, and I treated you like a tool. I don't know if you'll ever read this, but if you do, know that you won. Completely. And I'm glad you did. Your father. I read it 3 times, looking for the trap, the manipulation, the angle, but I couldn't find one. It was just the rambling confession of a broken man who'd finally understood the scope of his failures. Part of me wanted to feel satisfaction at this ultimate admission of defeat. Part of me wanted to feel vindication. Instead, I felt nothing, or close to nothing, a faint echo of the rage I'd carried through my first life's final years, but distant now, muted by time and success. My father had finally learned his lesson, but it was 5 years too late and a lifetime too little. His understanding didn't change what he'd done, didn't heal the wounds he'd inflicted, didn't restore the years he'd stolen. I filed the letter away in a drawer and went back to work. 2 months later, I learned that my father had died. A heart attack, quick and merciful. He'd been alone in his rented room, and his body hadn't been discovered for 3 days. I didn't attend the funeral. There wasn't one. He'd had no money for such things, no friends left to organize it. He was cremated at the state's expense, his ashes disposed of in an anonymous plot. It was a sad, lonely end for a man who'd once commanded respect and wielded influence. Part of me, a very small part, felt a twinge of pity. But mostly I felt relief. The final chapter was closed. The last thread connecting me to my old life was severed. Marina remained institutionalized, barely aware of the world. Celestia was still struggling in her coastal town, working her menial job, and now my father was gone, taking with him the last possibility of reconciliation or confrontation. I was truly free. That night, I took the framed map of the Thornback Mountains, the real one, off my wall. I'd kept it as a reminder, but I didn't need reminders anymore. I knew who I was, I knew what I'd survived, I knew what I'd built. I donated the map to the National Archives Permanent Collection, a genuine piece of careful cartographic work that would help future researchers. My gift, given freely this time, on my own terms. And then, I started planning my next chapter. I'd been offered a position at a prestigious university, teaching cartographic history and methodology. It would mean leaving the archives, leaving the capital, starting something new. The old me, the me from my first life, would have been terrified of such a change, would have clung to the security of the known. But I'd died once already. I'd been reborn. I'd orchestrated the downfall of everyone who'd ever hurt me. I'd built a life from nothing. What was a new job, a new city, a new beginning compared to all that? I accepted the position. 6 months later, I stood in front of my first class of graduate students, looking at their eager faces, their notebooks ready, their minds open to learn. Cartography, I began, is not just about drawing maps. It's about understanding truth and recognizing deception. It's about knowing the difference between what is real and what we want to be real. A student raised her hand. But how do you know the difference? How do you spot a fake map? I smiled, thinking of the careful forgery I'd created 5 years ago, the fake map that had destroyed my family so thoroughly. That's what we're here to learn, I said, because the best way to spot a lie is to understand how it's constructed. And sometimes the most convincing maps are the ones that lead nowhere at all. The class laughed, thinking it was just a clever metaphor. But I knew better. I'd spent 2 lifetimes learning that lesson, and now I would teach it to others. Not the revenge part, not the vindictive part, but the truth underneath, that knowledge is power, that understanding is freedom, and that sometimes the best map is the one that leads you away from the traps others would set for you. My story had begun with betrayal and death. It had continued with rebirth and revenge, but it ended here in this classroom with the knowledge that I'd not only survived but transcended everything that had tried to destroy me. I was Professor Alara Thorne now. The Thorne name wasn't a burden anymore. It was mine, reclaimed and redefined. And if my father's ghost could somehow see me now, teaching the art of cartography to students who would use it honestly, building a legacy based on truth instead of theft, I hoped it would haunt him. Because this honest success, this genuine respect, this real accomplishment was everything he'd wanted and never deserved. And I'd achieved it by giving him exactly what he did deserve: a map leading nowhere, a trap of his own making, and the consequences of a lifetime of cruelty. The best revenge, I'd learned, wasn't destruction. It was building something beautiful from the ashes of what others had tried to burn down. I'd been a victim. I'd been a weapon. Now I was simply myself, a woman who knew the true value of the gifts she carried, who used them on her own terms, who had learned that the real treasure was never in some hidden mine or stolen glory. The real treasure was freedom, choice, the power to draw your own map and follow it wherever it led. And my map led here, to this classroom, to this life, to this moment of perfect peace. The lost mines of Valdris had never existed. But I had found something far more valuable in that search: myself. And unlike silver or gems, unlike stolen fortunes or fake treasures, that discovery could never be taken from me. It was mine, eternally, completely, irrevocably mine. And that was worth more than all the treasures in the world.